What if I told you that somewhere in an old photo album might be the only picture of America's most mysterious serial killers? In 1873, a seemingly ordinary family posed for a photograph in front of their modest Kansas home. They appeared to be typical frontier settlers, hardworking immigrants pursuing the American dream on the vast prairie. But this innocent family portrait would become evidence in one of the most shocking crime sprees in American history. The Bender family operated a small inn and general store along the heavily traveled Osage Trail in Labette County, Kansas. To passing travelers, they were the picture of frontier hospitality. John Bender Sr., a German immigrant with broken English and a kind demeanor, had built a modest but comfortable establishment where weary travelers could find a hot meal and a clean bed. His wife, known simply as Ma Bender, was a devout woman often seen reading her Bible on the front porch. Their son, John Jr., helped with the heavy work, while their daughter, Kate, charmed guests with her education and claimed abilities as a spiritual medium. For nearly 3 years, from 1871 to 1873, the Benders served countless travelers without incident. Their inn became known as a reliable stop along the dangerous trail, where outlaws in harsh weather made every journey a risk. Guests praised Ma Bender's apple pie and Kate's entertaining stories of supernatural encounters. The family seemed to embody the pioneering spirit that was building America's frontier. But beneath this facade of ordinary frontier life lay a carefully orchestrated operation of murder and theft. The Benders had chosen their victims methodically, targeting wealthy travelers who carried large sums of money and were unlikely to be missed immediately. Their seemingly innocent family business was actually a trap designed to lure unsuspecting victims to their deaths. This is the story of how 4 ordinary-looking people became some of America's most notorious killers, and how they vanished completely, leaving behind only questions that remain unanswered more than 150 years later. John Bender Sr. presented himself as a simple German immigrant seeking prosperity in America's heartland. His heavy accent and limited English made him appear harmless to the travelers who stopped at his inn. He spoke of hard work, family values, and the opportunities that Kansas offered to those willing to build something from nothing. To his neighbors, he was a respected businessman who had invested his life savings in a legitimate enterprise, but John's past remained mysteriously vague. When asked about his origins, his story would change subtly. Sometimes he claimed to be from Germany, other times from Pennsylvania Dutch country. Local records show he purchased his Kansas property with cash, unusual for immigrants of modest means. Where did this money come from? His explanations never quite added up, but in the rapidly growing frontier territory, people were often too busy with their own struggles to ask too many questions. The inn's layout revealed John's true nature. The building wasn't designed for hospitality, it was engineered for murder. The main dining room featured a table positioned precisely near a canvas curtain that divided the space. This wasn't random frontier architecture. It was careful planning that allowed someone to hide behind the curtain and strike at guests seated at that specific table. John had designed his business as a trap. His role went beyond innkeeper. John was the strategist who evaluated potential victims as they approached. A wealthy merchant traveling alone received warm hospitality and encouragement to stay overnight. A family with children might be told there was no vacancy. Groups of armed men were politely directed to other establishments. John had developed a system for identifying the most profitable and least dangerous targets. Records from the period show that John always seemed to have money available, paying local suppliers in cash while other frontier businesses operated on credit. His family wore quality clothes and ate well, suggesting an income far beyond what a small inn should generate. The respected patriarch was actually the architect of a killing operation that would claim at least 11 lives before the family vanished into history. Ma Bender was known throughout the community as a devoutly religious woman who spent her evenings reading scripture on the front porch of the family inn. Her stern appearance and limited English made her seem like a typical frontier wife, hardworking, pious, and devoted to her family's success. Local women found her polite but distant, and never quite integrating into the social networks that bound frontier communities together. Behind this religious facade lay a woman who had created her own twisted theology to justify the family's crimes. In Ma Bender's worldview, wealthy travelers were guilty of the sin of greed and materialism. Taking their lives and possessions wasn't murder. It was divine justice, a correction of earthly inequalities that served God's will. She had convinced herself that each killing was an act of righteousness rather than crime. Ma Bender's domain was the kitchen, where she prepared more than just meals for their guests. Her knowledge of folk medicine and herbalism, learned in the old country, had been perverted into an instrument of death. She cultivated specific plants in the family garden and knew how to process their roots and leaves into powders that could incapacitate a grown man. The family's famous apple pie often contained more than fruit and spices. It served as a delivery system for sedatives that made victims drowsy and compliant. Her religious convictions provided the moral framework that allowed the entire family to function. While John planned the logistics and the younger members carried out the physical acts, Ma Bender supplied the justification that let them all sleep peacefully after each murder. She would lead family prayers thanking God for their blessings and asking for guidance in their work. Her Bible, always within reach, contained pressed flowers that she claimed brought good luck, flowers that actually grew from the graves behind their house. Local records indicate that Ma Bender was often seen tending to her garden, particularly in areas that neighbors later realized corresponded to burial sites. She would explain her frequent digging as necessary for her herbs and vegetables, but she was actually maintaining the hidden cemetery where the family disposed of their victims. Her maternal appearance made it impossible for anyone to suspect that she was caring for graves rather than gardens. Thus, contrast between her public persona and private reality was perhaps the most chilling aspect of the Bender crimes. Here was a woman who could serve dinner to travelers with genuine warmth, discuss scripture with visiting clergy, and then calmly help prepare those same guests for murder. Ma Bender represented the terrifying possibility that evil could hide behind the most respectable and seemingly godly exterior, making her perhaps the most dangerous member of the family. John Bender Jr. was barely 20 years old when his family's crimes were discovered, yet he had already become an experienced killer. To the outside world, he appeared to be nothing more than a shy young man helping his parents run their modest inn. His broken English and nervous demeanor made him seem harmless, even endearing to some guests who saw him as a hardworking son devoted to his family's success. But behind his awkward exterior, John Jr. was the family's primary executioner. His role required him to hide behind the canvas curtain that divided the inn's main room, waiting with a hammer for his father's signal. When unsuspecting guests were positioned at the designated table, John Jr. would emerge silently and deliver a crushing blow to the back of their heads. The efficiency and brutality of these attacks suggested someone who had perfected his technique through repeated practice. The psychological toll of his actions was evident in subtle ways that only family members recognized. John Jr. developed nervous tics and suffered from nightmares that left him disoriented and fearful. Yet he never questioned his role in the family business, accepting the killing as naturally as he might have accepted working a farm or running a legitimate store. His parents had shaped him from childhood to see their actions as necessary and justified. Evidence suggests that John Jr. was responsible for the deaths of at least 11 people, including a small child found buried with her father. This discovery was particularly shocking because it revealed that the family's cruelty extended even to innocent children. When their victim selection process failed and they were forced to eliminate entire families to prevent witnesses, John Jr. carried out these orders without hesitation or mercy. His youth made him malleable, easily influenced by parents who had convinced him that wealthy travelers deserved their fate. The transition from innocent farm boy to cold-blooded killer illustrated how ordinary people could be transformed into monsters through gradual exposure to violence and twisted moral reasoning. John Jr. represented the terrifying possibility that anyone, given the right circumstances and influences, might be capable of unspeakable acts. Kate Bender was the most dangerous member of the family precisely because she was the most charming. At 23, she possessed an education and sophistication unusual for frontier women, speaking perfect English and displaying a confidence that made her the family's primary interface with the outside world. Local newspapers had written about her, describing her as a spiritual medium who could communicate with the dead and heal the sick through supernatural powers. Her seances were elaborate performances that served multiple purposes beyond mere entertainment. Kate would arrange her guests around the infamous table, dimming the oil lamps to create an atmosphere of mystery and otherworldly connection. What participants didn't realize was that these gatherings allowed the family to identify wealthy targets, while Kate assessed each person's potential as a victim. Her spiritual readings were actually careful evaluations of guests' traveling plans, family connections, and most importantly, how much money they carried. Kate's feminine charm and apparent vulnerability made even cautious travelers lower their guard. She could convince hesitant guests to stay overnight instead of continuing their journeys, always with reasonable explanations about weather conditions or the dangers of night travel. Her education allowed her to engage visitors in sophisticated conversations about literature, philosophy, and current events, making the Bender Inn seem like an oasis of culture in the rough frontier territory. But beneath her charming exterior lay a calculating predator who felt no empathy for her victims. Kate was not merely participating in her family's murderous enterprise, she was its architect, the brilliant mind that had transformed a simple roadhouse into an efficient killing machine. Her ability to appear innocent while orchestrating death made her perhaps the most frightening killer in American history. The contrast between her public persona and private reality was absolute. The same woman who could entertain guests with poetry and philosophical discussions was also capable of watching them die without showing a trace of emotion. Kate Bender proved that intelligence, education, and charm could serve evil just as effectively as they could serve good, making her a uniquely terrifying figure in the annals of American crime. The Bender Inn appeared to be a typical frontier establishment, but every detail of its construction had been carefully planned to facilitate murder. The building's most sinister feature was invisible to guests, the canvas curtain that divided the main dining room. This seemingly innocent partition created two distinct spaces: the public area where guests ate their meals, and a private section where family members could move unseen and prepare for their deadly work. The curtain was positioned with mathematical precision. Anyone seated at the designated table near the front wall would have their back to the partition, making them vulnerable to attack from behind. The table itself was bolted to the floor to prevent movement, and the chairs were arranged to ensure guests sat in exactly the right position. What appeared to be casual furniture placement was actually a carefully engineered death trap. The building's floor told its own dark story. Beneath the rough wooden planks, the ground had been prepared with a slight slope leading to a concealed trapdoor. This engineering allowed blood to flow away from the dining area and made body disposal more efficient. The family had literally constructed their home on top of what would become a charnel house, with every beam and board serving their murderous purposes. Even the family's famous hospitality was weaponized. The positioning of oil lamps created specific lighting conditions that would blind guests to movement behind the curtain while illuminating their own positions perfectly. The placement of the kitchen door allowed Ma Bender to serve drugged food and retreat quickly to safety. The inn's isolated location ensured that screams would not carry to neighboring properties. The most chilling aspect of the inn's design was how normal it appeared to unsuspecting guests. Travelers saw a modest but comfortable frontier establishment run by a hard-working immigrant family. They had no idea they were entering a structure designed specifically for their deaths, where every comfort and convenience had been calculated to make murder easier and more efficient. The Bender Inn represented the ultimate perversion of frontier hospitality. For nearly 3 years, the Bender family operated what appeared to be a legitimate frontier business, while actually running one of the most efficient murder operations in American history. Their success depended on careful victim selection, precise timing, and the ability to maintain their facade of respectability even as they committed increasingly brutal crimes. Their location along the heavily traveled Osage Trail provided a steady stream of potential victims. The route connected Missouri to the developing territories further west, attracting merchants, land speculators, and settlers carrying their life savings in cash. The family's isolated position meant that missing travelers might not be noticed for weeks, giving them time to dispose of evidence and establish alibis. The Benders' selection criteria were ruthlessly practical. Wealthy individuals traveling alone received the warmest welcome and strongest encouragement to stay overnight. Groups of armed men were politely directed elsewhere as they posed too great a risk. Families with children were usually turned away, not out of mercy, but because multiple victims increased the chances of witnesses or complications. The family preferred targets who were prosperous, solitary, and vulnerable. Their method was refined through practice and became increasingly efficient over time. After identifying a promising victim, Kate would position them at the designated table for dinner, ensuring they sat with their back to the canvas partition. The family would engage in normal conversation, playing their respective roles perfectly while waiting for the right moment to strike. When John Jr. emerged from behind the curtain with his hammer, the victim rarely had time to understand what was happening. The financial success of their operation was evident in their lifestyle. Despite claiming to run a modest inn, the family possessed quality clothing, fine furniture, and always seemed to have cash available. Local merchants noted that they paid for everything immediately, never requesting credit like most frontier families. Their unexplained prosperity should have raised suspicions. But in the rapidly growing Kansas territory, sudden wealth was often attributed to legitimate opportunity rather than criminal activity. At least 11 people lost their lives to the Bender family's greed and brutality, though the true number may never be known since many travelers disappeared on the frontier without thorough investigations. Each victim had a story, dreams for the future, and family members who would spend years wondering what had happened to their loved ones. The discovery of their remains revealed the systematic nature of the Benders' crimes, and the cold calculation behind each murder that shocked investigators. Dr. William York was perhaps the most significant victim, though the family couldn't have anticipated the consequences of killing him. The respected physician from Independence, Kansas, was traveling to visit his brother when he stopped at the Bender Inn in March 1873. His disappearance would ultimately lead to the family's downfall, as his brother was Colonel Ed York, a man with substantial political connections, financial resources, and the determination to organize a thorough investigation that would uncover the truth. The discovery of a small girl's remains, buried alongside her father, particularly horrified investigators and the general public when news of the crimes spread. The child was no more than 7 years old, and her skull showed the same crushing injury that killed the adult victims. Her presence revealed that the family's cruelty extended even to innocent children, and that their victim selection process sometimes failed, forcing them to eliminate entire families to prevent witnesses from escaping. George Longnor and his infant daughter represented another tragedy that highlighted the family's complete lack of conscience or human empathy. Longnor was traveling with his baby when they encountered the Benders during what should have been a routine stop. Rather than turning them away as they typically did with families, something about Longnor, perhaps the money he carried or valuable items he possessed, made him too. tempting a target to pass up. Despite the complications, the victims shared certain characteristics that made them attractive to the Benders and vulnerable to their predatory schemes. Most were traveling alone or in very small groups, carried significant amounts of cash or valuable goods, and were following routes that would take them far from civilization, meaning their disappearances might not be immediately investigated by authorities. Each death represented not just the loss of a human life, but a carefully calculated crime that the family had planned and executed with methodical precision. A complete disregard for human suffering, Ender's crimes in the cold. Calculation behind each murder. Dr. William York was perhaps the most significant victim, though the family couldn't have anticipated the consequences of killing him. The respected physician from Independence, Kansas, was traveling to visit his brother when he stopped at the Bender Inn in March 1873. His disappearance would ultimately lead to the family's downfall, as his brother was Colonel Ed York, a man with the resources and determination to organize a thorough investigation. The discovery of a small girl's remains, buried alongside her father, particularly horrified investigators and the public. The child was no more than 7 years old, and her skull showed the same crushing injury that killed the adult victims. Her presence revealed that the family's cruelty extended even to innocent children, and that their victim selection process sometimes failed, forcing them to eliminate entire families to prevent witnesses. George Longnor and his infant daughter represented another tragedy that highlighted the family's complete lack of conscience. Longnor was traveling with his baby when they encountered the Benders. Rather than turning them away as they typically did with families, something about Longnor made him too tempting a target to pass up. Both father and child were murdered and buried together in the orchard behind the inn. The victims shared certain characteristics that made them attractive to the Benders. Most were traveling alone or in very small groups. They carried significant amounts of cash or valuable goods. They were following routes that would take them far from civilization, meaning their disappearances might not be immediately investigated. Each death represented not just the loss of a human life, but a carefully calculated crime that the family had planned and executed with methodical precision. By early 1873, the Bender family's carefully constructed world was beginning to show cracks. Their success had made them overconfident, and they had started taking greater risks with their victim selection. Local authorities were beginning to notice patterns in the disappearances of travelers along the Osage Trail, and questions were being asked that the family couldn't easily answer. And began with the disappearance of Dr. William York in March 1873, when the respected physician failed to arrive at his destination. His brother, Colonel Ed York, organized a search party that included local law enforcement and concerned citizens. The group was determined to trace the doctor's route and discover what had happened to him, bringing unprecedented scrutiny to the area around the Bender Inn. When the search party arrived at the Bender property in May 1873, they found it mysteriously abandoned. The family had vanished without warning, leaving behind their livestock, furniture, and even personal belongings. Their sudden departure raised immediate suspicions, especially when investigators discovered evidence of recent digging around the property and strange stains on the inn's wooden floors. The true horror was revealed when the search party began excavating the small orchard behind the house. One by one, they unearthed the bodies of at least 11 victims, including Dr. York. Each skull showed the same crushing injury, confirming that they had discovered the work of systematic killers rather than random violence. The methodical nature of the burials and the condition of the remains suggested that the murders had been taking place for years. News of the discovery spread rapidly across Kansas and beyond. Newspapers carried sensational accounts of the bloody Benders and their house of horrors, making them instant celebrities of the worst kind. Reward offers for their capture reached enormous sums, and law enforcement agencies across the country began searching for the missing family. But by then, the Benders had already disappeared into the vast American frontier, beginning one of the longest manhunts in American history. The Bender family's escape remains one of the greatest unsolved mysteries in American criminal history, a case that has frustrated investigators and fascinated the public for more than 150 years. Despite massive manhunts that covered multiple states, enormous reward offers that reached astronomical sums for the era, and investigations that stretched across territories and even into other countries, none of the 4 family members was ever captured, definitively identified, or brought to justice for their crimes. Evidence suggests the family had been planning their escape for weeks before the discovery of their crimes, showing a level of foresight and preparation that indicated they understood their operation couldn't continue indefinitely. Neighbors later recalled that they had been systematically selling livestock and possessions throughout April and early May 1873, claiming they were planning to move to better land with more opportunities. They had converted their assets to easily transportable wealth, cash and gold that would fund their flight from justice and allow them to establish completely new identities wherever they chose to settle. The family's disappearance was discovered on May 5th, 1873, but investigators believe they had actually fled several days earlier, giving them a crucial head start that proved decisive in their successful escape. Their wagon was found abandoned near the town of Thayer, Kansas, but the trail went completely cold from there despite intensive searching efforts. Some witnesses reported seeing them heading south toward Texas and the Mexican border, while others claim they had doubled back north toward Nebraska or the Dakota Territory, where they might blend in with other immigrant families. Over the following decades, dozens of alleged sightings and arrests made headlines across the country, generating enormous public interest and false hope for justice. However, none of these leads ever proved authentic when thoroughly investigated. The family seemed to have dissolved completely into the vast American frontier, perhaps assuming entirely new identities with forged documents, perhaps meeting their end in ways that left no trace for history to discover. Some historians believe they may have been killed by vigilantes or fellow criminals who discovered their true identities and sought the substantial reward money being offered. Others suggest they successfully disappeared into Mexico or even returned to Europe using false names and carefully constructed backgrounds. The Bender case established important precedents for interstate criminal investigation and highlighted the significant challenges of law enforcement in the rapidly expanding American frontier where people could disappear without a trace.